away from that man.
I'm a paramedic. This man is having a cardiac event. I need you to step back.
Step back now. You're interfering with my investigation. Show me your ID.
He can't stop. He could die.
Hey, let it work, man.
Back off.
A Florida paramedic responding to a medical emergency ends up in handcuffs, 7 hours in a holding cell, a $15.6 million federal lawsuit that would expose everything wrong with how some officers treat people who refuse to be intimidated. This wasn't a traffic stop gone bad. This was a woman doing her job getting arrested for it. Officer Travis Kendrick thought he understood authority. 8 years with the Jacksonville Police Department, 32 complaints filed against him, not one resulting in discipline. He'd learned that his badge meant compliance was expected, that questioning him was grounds for arrest, that certain people didn't get to assert rights. He'd operated this way for nearly a decade without consequences, until he walked up to an ambulance on a Tuesday morning and tried it with someone who knew exactly what the Constitution said about unlawful detention. The call came in at 6:47 a.m. Medical emergency at a construction site off Interstate 95. Possible cardiac event. Male in his 50s unconscious. Dispatch sent the closest ambulance from Jacksonville Fire Rescue. Unit 17. Driver Ramon Santos. Lead paramedic Keisha Robinson. Keisha had been a paramedic for 11 years. Before that, she'd served 6 years as a combat medic with the Army, deployed twice to Afghanistan. She'd kept soldiers alive under fire. She'd performed emergency procedures in conditions most people couldn't imagine. She had a Bronze Star and 3 commendations for valor. She was 34 years old, born and raised in Tallahassee, and she was exceptionally good at her job. The ambulance arrived at the construction site at 6:52. 5-minute response time. Keisha grabbed her medical kit and rushed toward the cluster of workers surrounding a man on the ground. Ramon followed with the stretcher and additional equipment. The man was unconscious, pale, sweating. Classic signs of cardiac distress. Keisha dropped to her knees beside him, fingers immediately checking for a pulse. "Pulse is weak and thready," she called to Ramon. "Breathing is shallow. Get the oxygen ready." She began her assessment. Quick, methodical, professional. This was what she'd trained for. What she'd done hundreds of times. The workers backed away, giving her space. Someone was on the phone with the patient's wife. Another worker was directing traffic away from the scene. Keisha worked fast. Oxygen mask on the patient. IV line started. Vitals checked and recorded. She was preparing to administer medication when she heard footsteps behind her. Heavy boots on gravel. She didn't look up. Couldn't afford to. Her patient was critical. Every second mattered. "Step away from that man," a voice said. Male, authoritative, demanding. Keisha's hands didn't stop moving. "I'm a paramedic. This man is having a cardiac event. I need you to step back. I said step away. Now." Keisha glanced up for the first time. Police officer. White male, late 30s, hand resting on his belt near his weapon. Badge number visible on his chest. 7329. Name tag reading Kendrick. His body language was aggressive. His tone suggested he expected immediate obedience. "Officer, I'm treating a critical patient," Keisha said, her voice calm but firm. "I can't step away. This man could die. You're interfering with my investigation. Move away from him or you'll be arrested." Investigation into what? Keisha's confusion was genuine. This is a medical emergency. There's no crime here. This man needs a hospital right now. That's for me to determine, not you. Something in Kendrick's tone triggered alarm bells in Keisha's mind. She'd dealt with difficult officers before. She'd worked scenes where police and medical personnel had to coordinate. But this felt different. This felt wrong. She made a split-second decision. She would continue treating her patient while trying to de-escalate whatever was happening with this officer. "Ramon, get the stretcher ready," she called. "We need to transport immediately." She turned back to Kendrick. "Officer, I don't know what you think is happening here, but this is a legitimate medical emergency. This man needs advanced cardiac care. We need to transport now." Kendrick stepped closer. His shadow fell across Keisha and her patient. "I need to see your identification and proof you're authorized to be here." My identification is in the ambulance. My certification is displayed inside the vehicle. I'm a licensed paramedic with Jacksonville Fire Rescue. You can verify that through dispatch. Right now, I have a critical patient who needs immediate transport. The construction site foreman stepped forward. Officer, she's the paramedic we called. This is Carlos. He collapsed about 10 minutes ago. We need to get him to a hospital. Kendrick ignored the foreman. His focus remained on Keisha. Ma'am, I'm ordering you to step away from that man and produce identification immediately. Keisha felt her anger rising but kept her voice controlled. Officer, I'm exercising my duty as a medical professional. Florida law requires me to provide care to critical patients. I'm not stepping away from someone having a heart attack to show you ID that's 30 feet away in my vehicle. You can walk to the ambulance and verify my credentials yourself if you need to, but I'm not stopping treatment. You're refusing a lawful order. That's obstruction. No. I'm treating a dying man. That's my job. The workers around them were watching now. Several had pulled out phones, recording. Keisha was vaguely aware of this but couldn't focus on it. Her patient's color was getting worse. His breathing was more labored. She needed to get him loaded and moving. Ramon, let's go, she said. We're out of time. She and Ramon moved to lift the patient onto the stretcher. Kendrick grabbed Keisha's arm. Don't move, you're under arrest. Keisha froze. The words didn't make sense. Under arrest? For what? For doing her job? For saving someone's life? She looked at Kendrick's hand on her arm, then up at his face. His expression was hard, determined. He wasn't backing down. Officer, if you don't let go of me right now, this man will die. Is that what you want? A dead patient because you needed to see my ID? You should have cooperated when I asked. This is your fault. The construction foreman was on his phone now, calling someone. Other workers were shouting at Kendrick. Ramon was frozen, unsure what to do, and Keisha's patient was deteriorating on the ground between them. Officer Kendrick pulled handcuffs from his belt. Turn around. Keisha made her decision. She would not turn around. She would not be handcuffed. Not while her patient was dying. Not while she had a duty to provide care. She pulled her arm away from Kendrick's grip and returned her attention to her patient. I'm not under arrest, she said firmly. I'm a paramedic performing my legal duty. You have no authority to interfere with emergency medical treatment. If you continue to obstruct my ability to provide care, you're the one breaking the law. Kendrick's face went red. He reached for her again, and this time Ramon stepped between them. His hands were up, defensive, non-threatening. Officer, please. This man is dying. Let her do her job. You can sort everything else out later. Move, Kendrick said. Ramon didn't move. The standoff lasted maybe 5 seconds. Then Kendrick made his choice. He grabbed Keisha's arm again, harder this time, and yanked her away from her patient. She stumbled backward. Her medical kit fell, contents scattering across the gravel. You're under arrest for obstruction and resisting, Kendrick said, spinning her around and pulling her arms behind her back. The handcuffs clicked around her wrists, metal biting into skin. The sound of it captured on multiple phones. My patient, Keisha said, her voice breaking. Someone help my patient. Ramon dropped beside the man on the ground, taking over treatment. His hands were shaking, but he worked through the protocols. The construction foreman was still on the phone, shouting now. Other workers were yelling at Kendrick. The scene was chaos. Kendrick walked Keisha toward his patrol car. She looked back at her patient, at Ramon working desperately to stabilize him, at the crowd of witnesses recording everything. She knew what this looked like. She knew what it was, and she knew that whatever happened next would define everything. The patrol car door slammed shut. Ramon was already on his phone, dialing his supervisor, explaining the situation in rapid bursts while continuing chest compressions on the patient. The construction foreman knelt beside him, following Ramon's instructions to maintain the airway. Around them, workers formed a loose circle, their phones capturing everything. Inside Kendrick's patrol car, Keisha sat in the back seat, handcuffs digging into her wrists. The plastic bench was hard beneath her. She could see through the metal partition dividing front and back. Kendrick stood outside, talking into his radio. His body language was tense, defensive. Even from here, she could read the situation deteriorating. Another ambulance arrived within 4 minutes. The responding medics rushed to the patient, taking over from Ramon. Keisha watched through the window as they worked. She recognized the lead paramedic, Sarah Chen, someone she'd trained with years ago. Sarah looked up toward the patrol car, confusion crossing her face when she spotted Keisha in handcuffs. The patient was loaded onto the stretcher and into the ambulance. Sarah spoke briefly with Ramon, glancing repeatedly toward the patrol car. Then the ambulance pulled away, lights flashing, siren wailing. Keisha watched it disappear around the corner. Her patient, someone she'd been treating, now being transported by another crew while she sat arrested. Kendrick climbed into the driver's seat. He started the engine without looking back at her. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the idle of the engine and the occasional crackle of his radio. "Officer," Keisha said, her voice steady despite the situation. "That man could die. You understand that, right? You just interfered with emergency medical care." Kendrick adjusted his rearview mirror. "You should have complied when I asked for identification. I was treating a critical patient. I didn't have time for your power trip." His jaw tightened. "That attitude is exactly why you're under arrest." Keisha leaned back against the seat. She knew this game. She'd seen it play out before. Officers who made bad decisions and then doubled down rather than admit error. But Kendrick had no idea what he'd just walked into. She had witnesses, multiple cameras, a patient who could corroborate her story, and most importantly, she knew the law. The drive to the police station took 12 minutes through midday traffic. Keisha used the time to calm her breathing, to organize her thoughts. She'd spent 15 years handling crisis situations. This was just another problem to solve. Different parameters, but the same fundamental approach. Stay calm, assess the situation, act decisively. At the station, Kendrick walked her inside. Other officers looked up from their desks. A few recognized her immediately. She'd been here before, dropping off patients who needed police escort to the hospital, coordinating with officers on overdose cases. One officer, a veteran named Lieutenant Grace Martinez, stood up from her desk, her expression shifting from curiosity to concern. "Kendrick, what's going on?" Martinez asked. "Arrested her for obstruction and resisting," Kendrick replied, guiding Keisha toward the booking area. Martinez's eyes narrowed. "That's Keisha Ramirez. She's one of our best paramedics. What exactly did she obstruct?" "She refused to show ID during an investigation." "What investigation?" Martinez stepped closer, her voice dropping but carrying authority. "She's a paramedic. She was on a call. She was interfering with my ability to do my job." Martinez looked at Keisha, then back at Kendrick. Her expression said everything she couldn't say out loud. "This doesn't look good." The booking process began. Fingerprints, photographs, personal belongings removed and cataloged, Keisha's medical kit, her phone, her wallet containing her paramedic certification, her driver's license, her medical credentials, everything she'd refused to show Kendrick earlier because her patient's life took priority. The booking officer, a younger man named Officer James Wright, processed her paperwork. He kept glancing at her credentials as he logged them. State-certified paramedic, advanced life support certification, 15 years of service, clean record, no arrests, no warrants, nothing that justified what was happening. "Ma'am," Wright said quietly, almost apologetically, "do you need medical attention? The handcuffs caused any injury?" "No," Keisha replied, "but my patient might need a lawyer. Officer Kendrick prevented me from completing emergency medical treatment." Wright's pen paused over the form. He looked up at Kendrick, who was standing against the wall with his arms crossed. Then Wright continued writing, but his expression had changed. Martinez approached again, this time with a file folder in her hand. "Kendrick, I need to talk to you, now." Her tone left no room for negotiation. They stepped away, but their voices carried. Keisha couldn't make out specific words, but Martinez's body language was unmistakable. Sharp gestures, pointed questions, Kendrick's defensive posture. This wasn't going the way he'd expected. Keisha was placed in a holding cell. The door clanged shut. She sat on the metal bench, her back against the cold concrete wall. Through the small window, she could see officers moving through the station. Some glanced her way. Word was spreading. She'd been in the cell for maybe 20 minutes when her phone rang in the evidence locker. She could hear it, faint but persistent. Someone was trying to reach her, probably her supervisor. Probably Ramon reporting what happened. The truth spreading while Kendrick's version was still being written. A woman in business attire appeared outside the cell. Mid-40s, carrying a briefcase, wearing an expression that suggested she dealt with situations like this before. Miss Ramirez. I'm attorney Diana Foster. Your partner called your union. They called me. I'm here to get you out and make sure this doesn't go any further than it already has. Keisha stood up. Thank you for coming. Foster pulled out a legal pad. Tell me exactly what happened. Start from the beginning. Don't leave anything out. Keisha recounted everything. The call, the patient, Kendrick's arrival, his demand for identification, her explanation about treating a critical patient, his escalation, the arrest. Foster took notes, asking clarifying questions, building the timeline. Did he read you your rights? Foster asked. No. Did he tell you what crime he suspected you of committing? No. He just kept demanding ID and said I was obstructing. Did you physically resist at any point? Never. I told him I was treating a patient and would provide identification once my patient was stable. That's not obstruction. That's doing my job. Foster closed her notepad. This is going to be straightforward. You were performing your legal duty as a paramedic. He interfered with emergency medical care. That's a violation of state law. The arrest is unlawful. We'll have you out within the hour and charges dropped by tomorrow. What about my patient? Foster paused. That's the part that worries me. If something happens to him because of the delay in treatment, Kendrick's in serious trouble, and the city knows it. Keisha leaned against the cell bars. I need to know if he's okay. I need to know what happened after they transported him. I'll make calls. Foster turned toward the front desk, already pulling out her phone. True to her word, Keisha was released 47 minutes later. The charges, obstruction and resisting, remained on paper, but Foster assured her they wouldn't survive initial review. She walked out of the station into afternoon sunlight. Her ambulance was parked across the street. Ramon was leaning against it, waiting. He straightened when he saw her. You okay? Been better. What about our patient? Ramon's expression was grim. Touch and go. They got him to the hospital. He's in surgery now. Ruptured spleen, internal bleeding. The delay getting him loaded probably cost him. Keisha's stomach dropped. The delay. Those crucial minutes, while Kendrick was demanding her paperwork, while he was pulling her away from a critical patient, while he was more concerned with his ego than someone's life. How bad? Ramon's jaw tightened. The surgeon said another 5 minutes and they might have lost him on the table. He coded twice during prep. They're doing everything they can, but it's close. Keisha felt the weight of it settle onto her shoulders. Not guilt, she'd done everything right, but the knowledge that Kendrick's actions had real consequences, that his need to assert authority had nearly killed someone. Foster appeared behind them, phone pressed to her ear. She looked at Keisha and nodded once. The charges are being reviewed by the district attorney's office. They're not moving forward with prosecution. This is done. What about the officer? Foster's expression hardened. Internal Affairs has opened an investigation, but that's separate from what we're doing. We're filing a federal civil rights lawsuit by end of week. This wasn't just bad policing. This was interference with emergency medical services. That's a felony in Arizona. Keisha looked back at the police station. Through the windows, she could see movement. Officers at desks, the normal flow of a shift change. Kendrick was somewhere in there, probably writing his report, probably convinced he'd done his job. He doesn't even understand what he did wrong, does he? Foster shook her head. In my experience, officers like him never do. They think the badge gives them authority over everyone in every situation. They don't understand that there are limits, that other professionals have duties that supersede police demands, that saving a life matters more than paperwork. The lawsuit was filed 3 days later. Keisha Ramirez versus Officer James Kendrick and the City of Phoenix. violation of civil rights, interference with medical care, false arrest. The complaint detailed everything in clinical precision. Timestamps from the ambulance dispatch system, medical documentation showing the patient's critical condition, witness statements from bystanders who saw Kendrick pull her away from active treatment. The city's response came fast. Too fast. Their attorney called Foster within 24 hours, asking about settlement terms. That's when Foster knew they had them. "They're scared," she told Keisha during a meeting at her office. "They know what this looks like. A police officer interfering with a paramedic treating a critical patient. A patient who nearly died because of the delay. This is indefensible. What do they want? To make it go away quietly. Settle for nuisance value, maybe $20,000. Keep it out of the news. Protect Kendrick's career." Keisha's response was immediate. "No." Foster smiled. "That's what I told them you'd say. So we're going to discovery. We're going to depose Kendrick. We're going to get the body camera footage, the dispatch recordings, the hospital records. We're going to build a case that shows exactly what happened and why it should never happen again." Discovery took 4 months. The body camera footage was damning. It showed Kendrick's initial approach, his immediate focus on credentials rather than the patient. It captured Keisha's repeated explanations about the medical emergency. It recorded her professional composure even as he escalated. Most importantly, it showed the patient's condition: gray skin, shallow breathing. The visible distress that any trained observer would recognize as life-threatening. The dispatch recordings added another layer. They showed Keisha calling for backup, reporting the delay, the stress in her voice when she said she had a critical patient and an officer interfering with treatment. The timestamps proved everything. Kendrick had detained her for 7 minutes while a man was bleeding internally. The hospital records were the final piece. The emergency room physician documented the patient's arrival, his critical condition, the emergency surgery required. In his notes, he wrote, "Patient arrived in extremis. Significant delay in transport contributed to deterioration. Another 5 to 10 minutes would likely have resulted in death." Foster compiled everything into a case file that was impossible to ignore. She scheduled depositions. Kendrick's was scheduled first. He showed up with the police union attorney. Confident, defensive, Foster spent 6 hours picking apart his decisions. "Did you observe the patient's condition before demanding identification?" "I observed the scene." "Did you notice the patient's skin color, his breathing, his level of consciousness?" "I was focused on verifying identities." "Miss Ramirez told you multiple times she was treating a critical patient, correct?" "She was being uncooperative." "Did you have medical training that allowed you to assess whether the patient was actually critical?" Silence. "Did you consider that a licensed paramedic might know more about medical emergencies than you do?" The union attorney objected, but the damage was done. The deposition transcript would show Kendrick's complete disregard for the medical emergency. His assumption that his authority superseded Keisha's professional judgment, his inability to admit he'd made a mistake. The city's attorney called Foster the next day. They wanted to talk settlement again. The number had changed significantly. They were offering $200,000. "Still no," Keisha said when Foster relayed the offer. "This isn't about money. It's about making sure this doesn't happen to another paramedic, another patient." The case went to mediation. A retired federal judge listened to both sides present their arguments. The city brought their risk assessment, their insurance calculations, their desire to avoid a trial. Foster brought the body camera footage, the hospital records, the deposition transcripts. She brought Keisha in her uniform, professional and composed, ready to testify about what it meant to have police interfere with emergency medicine. The mediator took a break after the morning session. When he returned, he looked at the city's attorney with something close to disbelief. "You're going to lose this case," he said bluntly. "Badly. A jury is going to watch that body camera footage and see an officer pull a paramedic away from a dying patient because he wanted to see paperwork. They're going to hear the ER doctor say the delay nearly killed the patient. You need to settle this. Now." The final settlement was $675,000. More importantly, it included policy changes. The Phoenix Police Department agreed to implement new protocols for interactions with emergency medical personnel. Officers would receive mandatory training on when and how to interact with paramedics on scene. They would be explicitly instructed that active medical treatment takes precedence over administrative requests. Any interference with emergency medical care would trigger automatic review. Kendrick was terminated 2 weeks after the settlement was finalized. The Internal Affairs investigation found multiple policy violations: interference with medical care, false arrest, failure to recognize exigent circumstances. His termination letter was made public, a warning to other officers about the consequences of letting authority override common sense. Keisha used a portion of the settlement to establish a legal defense fund for first responders. Paramedics, EMTs, firefighters who faced retaliation or interference for doing their jobs. She partnered with the State EMS Association to develop training materials showing emergency responders how to handle police interference while protecting patients. The body camera footage became required viewing at police academies across the country. Not just Phoenix, everywhere. Training instructors would pause the video at specific moments, breaking down each decision point where Keisha could have escalated but chose protocol instead, where she could have argued but stayed clinical, where she could have let ego override patient care but kept focus on the man dying in front of her. The footage showed something most training scenarios couldn't replicate: real stakes, actual consequences. A paramedic choosing between her pride and someone's life, making that choice in seconds while a police officer actively interfered. Every academy that showed the video asked the same question afterward: what would you have done differently? Most officers admitted they wouldn't have handled it as well as Keisha did. Some admitted they would have made the same mistakes the officer in the video made. The National Association of Emergency Medical Technicians invited Keisha to speak at their annual conference. 3,000 paramedics, EMTs, and emergency responders filled the convention center in Denver. She walked onto the stage in her Phoenix Fire Department uniform, the same one she'd been wearing that night, and the room went completely silent. She didn't start with the incident. She started with the patient, a 63-year-old man who got to walk his daughter down the aisle 6 months after nearly dying in a parking lot. Who got to meet his first grandchild 8 months after that? Who sent Keisha a Christmas card every year with a photo of his growing family and a note that always said the same thing: "Thank you for fighting for me when I couldn't fight for myself." Then she talked about the arrest, the handcuffs, the humiliation, the fear that she'd lose everything she'd worked for because she refused to let a patient die while she produced paperwork. She talked about sitting in that holding cell, wondering if doing the right thing was going to cost her the career she loved. But mostly, she talked about the importance of knowing the law, understanding your scope of practice, recognizing when you have the legal authority to tell even a police officer no. Because if you don't know your rights, you can't protect your patient's rights. If you don't understand the law, you can't stand up to someone who's violating it. The legal defense fund she established processed 47 cases in its first year. Paramedics facing retaliation for refusing to release patients to police custody. EMTs disciplined for contradicting officers at scenes. Firefighters written up for prioritizing medical care over law enforcement requests. Every case involved first responders who did their jobs correctly but faced consequences because someone with a badge didn't like being told no. The fund provided attorneys, expert witnesses, training materials, but more importantly, it provided validation, proof that standing up for your patient isn't insubordination. That following medical protocols isn't obstruction. That saving lives sometimes means challenging authority. Phoenix Fire Department updated their training manual. They added an entire section on interactions with law enforcement at emergency scenes. Clear guidelines about when paramedics had authority to refuse police requests. Explicit language about patient care taking precedence over administrative demands. Contact information for legal support if officers retaliated. The section was named after Keisha, though she'd tried to stop them from doing that. The Phoenix Police Department's new protocols were more detailed. Officers responding to medical emergencies received specific training about not interfering with active treatment, Supervisors were required to respond to any scene where conflict arose between police and medical personnel. Any officer who arrested a paramedic or EMT faced automatic investigation, regardless of circumstances. But the most significant change happened at the state level. Arizona passed legislation explicitly protecting first responders from arrest while performing emergency medical care. The law created a legal framework making it clear that paramedics in the field had authority over their patients, that medical decisions took precedence over law enforcement requests during active treatment, that retaliation against first responders for prioritizing patient care was illegal. The bill passed unanimously. Both parties, every representative. The governor signed it in a ceremony at the state capitol with Keisha standing beside him. They called it the First Responder Protection Act, though everyone involved knew it as Keisha's Law. Other states started introducing similar legislation: Colorado, Oregon, Washington, New Mexico. Each bill cited the Phoenix case. Each referenced the body camera footage showing what happens when police authority clashes with medical necessity. Each acknowledged that first responders needed legal protection to do their jobs effectively. The patient from that night, the man whose life Keisha fought to save, testified at several of those legislative hearings. He would sit in the witness chair, this ordinary guy who happened to have a heart attack at the wrong time, and tell lawmakers what it felt like to be dying while two people argued over paperwork above his head. He'd describe hearing the paramedic's voice cutting through the fog, telling him to stay with her, promising she wouldn't let him go. Then he'd look directly at the legislators and ask them a simple question. Do you want first responders worrying about saving lives or worrying about getting arrested? Nobody ever argued with him after that. Keisha went back to work 3 months after the settlement. Same ambulance, same partner, same 24-hour shifts running calls across Phoenix. But something had changed. Other paramedics looked at her differently now, not with pity or sympathy, but with respect, recognition that she'd fought a battle they all feared fighting, and won. She still got nervous when police showed up at scenes. Still felt her heart rate spike when an officer approached her ambulance. Still had moments where she second-guessed her decisions, wondering if standing firm was worth the cost. But she also knew that somewhere out there, other paramedics were making different choices because she'd made hers, refusing improper demands, citing protocols, protecting patients even when it meant conflict. The body camera footage lived online forever. Anyone could watch it, see exactly what happened, draw their own conclusions about who was right and who was wrong. The comments sections were predictable. Some people defended the officer, some attacked him, some praised Keisha, some questioned her judgment. But the footage itself remained unchanged. Objective documentation of a confrontation that shouldn't have happened, and a paramedic who refused to let authority override medical necessity. Years later, nursing students studying emergency medicine watched that footage in their classes. Law students studying Fourth Amendment protections analyzed it in constitutional law courses. Police recruits examined it during ethics training. Medical residents preparing for emergency rotations learned from it. The 9 minutes captured on that camera became a teaching tool across multiple professions, showing different audiences different lessons about authority, responsibility, and the cost of doing what's right. Keisha never wanted to be famous, never sought attention. She just wanted to save lives and go home at the end of her shift. But sometimes, the right thing puts you in positions you never asked for. Sometimes, standing firm means becoming an example. Sometimes, one person's refusal to back down changes the rules for everyone who comes after. That's what happened in a Phoenix parking lot. One paramedic, one patient, one choice. And a legal precedent that protected thousands of first responders who would face similar moments in the years ahead. The settlement money helped. The policy changes mattered. But the real impact was simpler than that. Keisha showed that you could challenge authority and survive, that doing your job correctly was worth defending, that sometimes the most important thing a first responder can do is refuse to stop responding. The case established something that should have been obvious but wasn't. that emergency medical personnel operating within their scope of practice have authority that supersedes administrative convenience, that saving lives takes priority over satisfying procedural demands, that first responders deserve protection when they choose patient welfare over compliance with questionable orders. Foster's firm took on 17 similar cases in the 3 years following Keisha's settlement. Paramedics arrested for refusing to release patients to police custody without proper medical clearance. EMTs detained for contradicting officers about injury severity. Firefighters cited for blocking traffic lanes to protect accident scenes. Every case involved someone doing their job correctly and facing retaliation because authority figures didn't like being challenged. The Legal Defense Fund covered attorney fees for cases the firm couldn't take directly. Small departments in rural areas where a single paramedic faced termination for following protocols. Private ambulance companies pressured by law enforcement to discipline employees who asserted medical authority. Volunteer fire departments threatened with funding cuts after members refused improper police demands at emergency scenes. Every case won, not always in court, sometimes through settlements, sometimes through department policy changes that made litigation unnecessary. But the pattern was consistent. When first responders documented their actions, followed established protocols, and prioritized patient care, they prevailed. The body camera footage from that Phoenix parking lot created a legal framework that protected them. The patient, whose name was David Brennan, became an advocate himself. He attended legislative hearings in 4 states, always telling the same story: how he'd felt himself slipping away, how he'd heard arguing voices above him but couldn't process what they were saying, how he'd woken up in a hospital bed 3 days later and learned that the paramedic treating him had been arrested for refusing to stop treatment. Brennan was a construction foreman, not political, not particularly interested in policy debates, but he understood debt, understood obligation, understood that he was alive because someone had prioritized his life over her freedom, so he showed up when asked, testified when needed, answered questions from legislators who wanted to understand what these abstract legal principles meant for actual human beings. His testimony was more effective than any expert witness. No legal jargon, no constitutional arguments. Just a man explaining what it felt like to be dying while the person trying to save him got handcuffed for doing her job. Legislators who might have dismissed the issue as professional squabbling between agencies couldn't dismiss that. The Phoenix Police Department's reforms extended beyond just protocols about medical scenes. They implemented an early warning system that flagged officers who accumulated complaints about interference with other emergency responders. Mandatory counseling for anyone who arrested a paramedic, firefighter, or EMT. Automatic review by the chief's office for any incident where medical personnel filed grievances about police conduct at emergency scenes. The changes weren't popular with everyone. Some officers felt they undermined police authority. Some argued that criminals could exploit the protections by claiming medical emergencies. Some maintained that paramedics needed to understand that police authority was absolute, that challenging an officer's decisions should have consequences. But the department leadership recognized the liability, recognized that another incident like Keisha's would cost more than money, would cost community trust, would cost relationships with fire departments and ambulance services that police relied on for mutual aid, would cost the department's credibility when defending officers in court. So, the reforms stuck, became standard procedure, got incorporated into training so thoroughly that new recruits didn't remember a time when interfering with emergency medical care was considered acceptable. The culture shifted because the alternative was too expensive. Keisha never stopped being a paramedic, never moved into administration or training or any of the desk jobs people suggested would be less stressful. She worked the streets because that's where the patients were, where the need was, where the job she'd trained for actually happened. She ran into officers who'd been part of the incident, saw them at scenes, worked calls where they provided traffic control or crowd management. Some avoided eye contact, some nodded acknowledgement. Some approached her during quiet moments and said they wished things had gone differently that night. She accepted their words without much comment. What mattered wasn't apologies. What mattered was that the same situation wouldn't play out the same way again. The body camera footage accumulated millions of views across various platforms, training videos, news segments, legal education channels. Documentary filmmakers requested permission to use it. Textbook publishers wanted to include still frames. Every request went through the same analysis. Would it help first responders? Would it advance patient care? Would it prevent another paramedic from facing what Keisha faced? If yes, permission granted. The footage showed something most people never considered: that medical emergencies don't pause for administrative procedures, that seconds matter when someone's dying, that the person trying to save a life shouldn't have to choose between their patient and their freedom. These lessons seemed obvious once stated, but the footage proved they weren't obvious to everyone. 5 years after the incident, Keisha spoke at a conference for emergency medical services directors. She told them what she'd learned. Not about the arrest or the lawsuit or the settlement. About the moment in that parking lot when she'd made her choice. When she'd looked at a dying patient and a demanding officer and decided which obligation mattered more. She told them that moment would come for everyone in emergency medicine eventually. Maybe not identical circumstances, maybe not police interference, but some situation where following protocol meant conflict. Where doing the right thing meant consequences. Where the easy choice was compliance and the hard choice was standing firm. And she told them what she'd learned from choosing the hard option, that you could survive it, that the system would eventually support you if you were right. That documentation mattered, that knowing the law mattered, that having the courage to say no to authority when patient care required it was exactly what the job demanded. The conference attendees gave her a standing ovation, but afterward, in private conversations, dozens of them approached with their own stories. Times they'd been pressured to compromise patient care, times they'd faced retaliation for following protocols, times they'd wondered if standing firm was worth the personal cost. They wanted to know how she'd done it, how she'd maintained composure, how she'd survived the aftermath. Her answer was consistent. She'd done the job she was trained to do. She'd followed the protocols she'd sworn to uphold. She'd prioritized the patient who needed her most. Everything else was secondary. The arrest was illegal. The charges were groundless. The settlement was validation. But none of that mattered more than the fact that David Brennan walked his daughter down the aisle because she'd refused to stop treating him. That's what made it worth it. Not the money or the policy changes or the legislative reforms. The patient who lived. The life that continued, the family that stayed whole. That was the measure of whether she'd made the right choice. Everything else was just documentation. The story spread through emergency medical services communities nationwide, became shorthand for a specific type of situation. Paramedics facing improper interference would reference it. Training officers would cite it. Union representatives would invoke it when defending members. It became part of the professional culture, a reminder that patient care came first, and the law protected those who prioritized it. Keisha's career continued without the dramatic arc people expected. No book deals, no movie rights, no transition into public speaking or advocacy. She worked her shifts, ran her calls, saved the lives she could save, and mourned the ones she couldn't. The incident that made her known across her profession became just one story among thousands she accumulated over the years. But it remained the story other first responders needed to hear, the one that proved you could do the right thing and survive the consequences. That standing up to improper authority wouldn't end your career, that the law, applied correctly, protected people who protected patients. That's what changed, not just policies or procedures or legal precedents. The understanding among first responders that they had backup when they made hard choices for the right reasons. That they weren't alone when they faced retaliation for following protocols. That someone had fought that battle and won, and the victory belonged to everyone who came after. Some battles change everything by being fought once, so others don't have to fight them again. This was one of those battles. One paramedic, one patient, one refusal to comply with an unlawful demand, and a legal framework that protected thousands of first responders who would face similar moments in the years ahead. That's the real measure of what happened in that Phoenix parking lot. Not what it cost one person, but what it prevented for countless others. That's the legacy that mattered. This case was disturbing, but the one on the right ends in a way no one expects.